when we were doing the High Middle Ages, you'll remember that one of the trends was bringing more and more land into agricultural production. However, remember, this class, we're moving on into the later Middle Ages. We're hitting around the year 1300. As a result of bringing more and more land into crop growing, and this process is what we call assarting, famine was pretty rare in the High Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, it was pretty common, but famine was a lot less intense in the High Middle Ages because of these land clearances. It doesn't mean that they were like loads of food, but famines tended to be very localized in particular areas, and locally devastating, of course, because they don't have our modern supply networks in the Middle Ages. So getting food to the places that needed it, not very easy to happen. However, land, this process of assarting, clearing previously land that was not used for agriculture, like forest or draining swamps, it's a finite resource. There's only so much of Europe that you can turn into land for agriculture before you just physically run out of land. And what then happens is what some economic historians call the impact of the Malthusian equilibrium. And this was proposed by an economist called Thomas Malthus. It's a vast oversimplification, so don't be jumping to too many conclusions and applying it to today. It is very much an oversimplification. But the theory is that you reach the maximum amount of cultivable land. That means you've got as much food as can be produced to support the population. So that's on one side of the scale. On the other side of the scale, better food means better health. It means a longer life. It means population growth. So on one side of the scale, this balance, equilibrium, is the amount of food that can be produced, and then on the other side is the amount of population that can be sustained through this food. The theory that Malthus proposed was if you take one of these away, the other one is going to have to alter itself to maintain this equilibrium, this balance. So in the case of the early 14th century, they've reached the maximum capacity of food production. If that food production drops, the population is going to have to drop in tandem in line with the amount of food. And that is the Malthusian equilibrium theory. What really made famine so much worse in the early 14th century was climate change. Rain destroyed 3 back-to-back harvests from 1314 to 1317. And since it was such heavy rainfall, it particularly affected wheat, rye, and the legumes. So their main grains and the foods that they used to maintain soil productivity and mainly feed the animals, all badly affected. The other downside for rain was soils were waterlogged, hilly areas suffered erosion from flooding, soil exhaustion was therefore becoming a real problem. The rain was leaching minerals from the soil. It also promoted the growth of mold and mildew. Because it was raining, they couldn't dry the grains. You have to dry the grain before you can start processing it to eat it. So it would rot if it was inside or outside. And actually, the gases that drying grains produce, if they're wet, can actually cause fire, can actually be pretty dangerous. So this means what happens in the early 14th century in Europe is a real disaster. They've reached the limit of cultivable land, and they've got several years worth of harvest failure. And so this is why Malthus proposed this theory. Not only did they have failed harvests those 3 years, and this is right across Europe, their winters were also far, far colder than usual. This killed a lot of animals who were used to living outside. It also reduced the growing season. And then that meant that the food available for growing was reduced for both humans and animals. We've got lots of documentation of storms, of flooding, frozen seas, right across Northern Europe. What was going on was a period of climate change. The High Middle Ages have been characterised by several hundred years of what climate historians call the medieval warm period. Around the year 1300 is the beginning of a period climate historians call the Little Ice Age. And the Little Ice Age lasted through to the Industrial Era. It lasted for several hundred years. Now, in the medieval warm period, as the name suggests, the average temperature across Europe was a couple of degrees higher than the normal. What this meant was that areas that were maybe more marginal were warm enough to grow crops, that the winters were shorter, so longer growing seasons. This meant, for example, we did encounter this when we talked about Greenland and how Eric the Red settled Greenland. He arrived at the beginning of the medieval warm period. Chances are he was pitching up at Greenland just at the time that it was actually able to support human beings who were not already well adapted to cold climates. By the time we hit around the year 1300, Little Ice Age is happening, and as the name suggests, everything is a couple of degrees colder on average than the normal, and this is a global trend. This means in the likes of Greenland, it's a lot colder than it had been before. So this is probably an explanation for why the Viking colonies died out there. Turning back to Western Europe, though, it means that the growing seasons, not as long, not as much crops being produced, and then comes the harvest failure. So this means very quickly famine sets in. Not only famine, but market failure. Because of the lack of crops, they went up in price. Wheat went up on average about 250% in costs. In northern France, we think as high as 800%. Governments and monarchs tried to prevent hoarding, but didn't seem to do much good because they didn't really have much economic clout. We're not dealing, as you know, with a time period where there's centralised government. It's a feudal society. It's very hard to enforce price controls and to stop people from hoarding. Unless you've got a central government to do it. So the only ones who really had any success in doing that were the guilds in the towns and the merchants. So we end up very rapidly with famine taking place. Because people were living pretty close to the edge, as it were, and they needed to keep a certain amount of their seed back for growing the next year, and of course they're going to tap into that. Now, that would be recoverable from if it had been only for a year, but they had 3 years of harvest failures across Europe. And then you end up with particularly the poorest suffering. Famines could be very localised, but this was across Europe. The only place that was not as badly affected was further south, the Mediterranean. But as we know, it's not like they had the global supply networks we do now to move food rapidly from the Mediterranean to elsewhere in Northern Europe. Consequences from this is what became known as the Great Famine. On average, we struggled to identify, as you know from Black Death last week, to get really good sense of demographics. We think around 5 to 15% of the European population died in this famine, which lasted from 1315 to 1322. Although where you were, it depended on the actual dates. But it lasted all the way from Ireland in the west to Poland in the east. Some areas were lower, some areas were higher mortality rates. In England and Wales, we think it's maybe 10 to 15% mortality rates. You're going to have a couple of videos to watch. They were on the previous slide, but I'm going to put the links up on the Nearpod as well. Now, as with one before, these are videos that are coming through Kent Library, coming through Films on Demand. So this means that they might be a bit icky with you being at home clicking through to them. So if they're being a bit iffy with you, go and open the library website in your browser and log in and then click the link and it should work. And if that doesn't work, don't worry, it's just an interesting perspective because it's a case study. It's talking about a particular village in England and the impact of all that I've just described on a small population. In England, 1318, things started to go back to normal. So they had 3 years of really, really bad famine. But it took until 1320 or even 1322 elsewhere in Europe. So this famine was devastating. But in terms of human processes, it's actually pretty short term. What made it worse was it wasn't just that these people had to contend with food shortages. In terms of the crops being affected and also their wine, so they couldn't even drink their worries away, God help them. But there was another event, the Great Bovine Pestilence, and this was from 1319 to 1320. This was probably a virus called rinderpest. Rinderpest only affected cattle. I'm saying affected in the past tense because it, along with smallpox, is one of only 2 diseases successfully eradicated by humans. Maybe getting there with polio, but in terms of infectious diseases, only smallpox and rinderpest so far. They focused on rinderpest because it was so devastating to animals. And in the outbreak that took place in 1319 to 1320 right across Europe, we reckon about 62% of the cattle population was killed by this virus. These animals were doubtless weakened as well by famine because, you know, if the human beings can't afford to eat, then they're not going to feed their animals as much as they would like to. Also, there will be outdoors, it's very cold, it's very wet, they're not great conditions for animals. It's likely they had other diseases, so comorbidities, in particular worms, because of how wet and damp it was. The impact of this colossal death, mortality of the cattle was that there was a milk shortage until at least 1332. That's because more cows, the female cattle, were affected than bulls and oxen. About 2/3 of all female cattle in Europe were killed by this virus over the year 1319 to 1320, about half of bulls and oxen. This has a lot of consequences, okay? It's not just a huge impact on people's nutrition. For example, oxen, they're the main plough animal, not a horse. You lose the ability to have ploughs, to plough the fields, to plant crops. It's going to be very hard to recover from a famine that's affecting your crop growing. The other thing, they don't have our fertilizers in the Middle Ages. They don't have our chemicals. The only thing they've got to work with is animal poo, manure. Fewer cattle, a lot less poo to fertilize with. And then there's beef, if they ate meat. But then the biggest is dairy, the dairy consumption. Animals take longer to grow than crops. Duh, yes. It takes about 10 years for the cattle population to recover. And they went for the oxen first, replenishing the oxen population first, not the cows. This means that not until the Black Death are things back to normal in terms of the impacts from the famine and from the bovine pestilence. This means that the nutrition of people across Europe was impacted for about a 20-year period, from around roughly 1320 to 1340, particularly in terms of their dairy consumption. And that means dairy consumption. If we were in class, I'd then ask you, what's dairy consumption going to do? And you would say, oh, it's going to affect your calcium. Yes, it will. It's going to have very bad effects on your body and on your bones. So there were a lot of consequences from these 2 things. But to begin with, it was pretty quick population rebound, which led to people over time to say, oh, yes, this was a Malthusian crisis. That is a situation caused by this lack of equilibrium. Possibly people got a bit more adventurous in their diet. That's a good thing because it meant they got more variety, more minerals and vitamins in the long term. So that was a good thing. But, you know, in the short term, people can't afford to buy food. Well, then they can't afford to pay their rent. So rent and payments to the church in form of tithes and rents to the lords are going to suffer. Remember, in the Middle Ages, there was no welfare state. If people got sick, if they lost their main breadwinner, the main source of charity comes from the church. So people turn to the church for help. But the church did not have the income to do this. And this means they did not help people when people turned to them for help. And this leads to a lot of mistrust of the church. We find more marginal land, the land that maybe should never been brought into cultivation, been abandoned. And we find a lot of villages being deserted. We find people signing up for much more difficult conditions with the lords, just as a way to get them and their family food. And we have an increase in the urban population. What this pretty grim manuscript image on the right here shows, urbanization, people moving from the countryside to the cities. They might have to beg when they get to the cities, but they hope they don't die. They hope they do better in the free market economy in the cities. So we see increased amounts of beggars. They seem to have gone to commercial centres for migration. But as this particularly horrible picture shows, people dead on the road, people who simply did not make it. Some of these people started to keep on moving eastwards into areas that were just being reclaimed from Slavic or Baltic control. And of course, there's scapegoating. Again, and we learned all about that last week. And again, it's the same groups of people that are blamed earlier during the famine and the Great Bovine Pestilence. They blame the Jews, they blame the lepers for poisoning them. And these were going to flare up yet again during the Black Death. Lawlessness, theft, commonly reported at the time. In urban areas, of course, all these migrant peasants will have been robbing and begging, leading to these reports. There are lots of reports of grave robbing. People were looking for items to rob from the graves that they could sell. But this leads to reports of things like cannibalism. And I've got a question mark after cannibalism here, because I don't know how many people were digging up dead bodies to eat them. I think that's pretty extreme, but I think they were digging up dead bodies to see if they maybe had any jewellery on them or any clothes that they might be able to sell for food. We also, as we're going to see later this class, have epidemic warfare at the time, so the effects of these were even worse. Trade was disrupted. This is an impact on the cities. Even in the cities, rents weren't being paid and people were suffering. Because remember, the people in the cities also are completely reliant on the countryside for all their food. They don't have crops growing in their back gardens because they have different occupations. All of this means there's a really bad state of affairs by the time the Black Death breaks out in the middle of the 14th century. The population across Europe was likely already weakened by these experiences. 10 to 15%, well, maybe 5 to 15% of the people were killed by famine. The population did bounce back pretty quickly, which shows that the situation was pretty untenable. We had the movement of the poor to the cities, and this might have helped spread plague faster if there were a lot of malnourished people living in bad conditions in urban places. We can find evidence of this when we look at osteoarchaeology. Two scholars, Philip Slavin and Sharon DeWitt, they looked at the skeletons and the burial records from a burial ground in London, and they looked to see what the impact on people physically was caused by the Great Famine and the bovine pestilence. So they looked at East Smithfield Cemetery, and this was founded in 1348, so right at the height of when the Black Death was hitting London. They examined their bones. They were looking for stressors on the bones and the teeth. So was their height shorter than other populations? Did they have bone lesions on the heads, on the eye sockets? Did they have horizontal lines on their teeth? And usually at this point, everybody now starts rubbing their teeth to see whether they've got horizontal lines. No, you do not. If you've got horizontal lines on your teeth, it means that you've had extreme malnutrition as a small child when your teeth were forming. It's the interruption of the enamel growth on your teeth. So they looked at these indicators on the bones of people who were buried in 1348 in the East Smithfield Cemetery to see what the impact of what their lives had been like before they were killed by the Black Death. They found that people were actually a little bit smaller, and these people showed more stress markers. They just were generally unhealthier. What they think they were able to find were the long-term effects of a long-term calcium deficiency on these people. That they were seeing that their bones hadn't formed right and their teeth hadn't formed right. They hadn't had calcium when they were little kids during the famine and during the Great Bovine Pestilence and after. Because if you were a little kid, during the famine and the Great Bovine Pestilence, you were reaching peak adulthood by the time the Black Death hit. So this means that the people who were most affected by the Black Death probably had a lot of ongoing health problems that they might not have even been aware of. This means that people probably recovered from the famine a bit faster, but they had a long time took them a long time to recover from the Great Bovine Pestilence. So this morning, more work needs to be done on this kind of research to really link all the impacts of the Black Death together. But it does look like there's lots of things going on. That yes, it was an awful disease. Yes, there was a pneumonic version, but it might be that this population was particularly vulnerable, the adult population, who usually would not have been so susceptible to a bacteria. Okay, the next things for you to do are to watch these 2 video clips, which are 2 short video clips about the impact on Kibworth Village in England of the famine and the cattle plagues. Then I want you to go and read some primary source extracts, which are all talking about the impacts of famine in different parts of Europe. And then there'll be a question for you to answer before we move on to church impacts. We move on to war. We move on to revolts, where we see all that we've just discussed now mishmashed in with the effects of the Black Death too.